It was one of those slow, honey-colored Sundays when the house felt too quiet for its own good. I'd already done the laundry, watered the plants, even rearranged the books by color, anything to keep my hands busy. When I reached David's office, I paused. He'd always called it his sanctuary, and I usually respected that. But something in me wanted to step inside, just to feel closer to him. The air smelled of paper and faint coffee, stale, forgotten, like the room had been left behind. As I dusted the bottom shelf, my rag brushed against something solid, tucked behind a row of old folders. A small wooden box. Heavy, carved, almost beautiful in a way. I tried one of the drawer keys, then another. None worked. When I shook it gently, something shifted inside, a muffled clink that made my heart skip. It wasn't the sound of notes. It was the sound of secrets. My fingers tingled, curious and cautious all at once. "David?" I called, trying to sound casual. "What's this little box in your office?" His answer came fast. Too fast. "Don't touch that. It's old work stuff." I frowned. "Then why's it locked?" He laughed nervously. "Because I lose things, remember?" I smiled back, but something in his tone made the room colder. I put the box down, pretending not to care. But later, when I tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking. No one locks work notes. That night, I couldn't shake the image of that little wooden box. It sat behind my eyes, taunting me with its silence. David had brushed it off so easily, but his voice had that sharp tremor I knew too well. The kind he used when he was hiding something small enough to deny, yet big enough to matter. I tried reading, even turned on a show, but every sound from his office seemed amplified. It was ridiculous, really. A grown woman losing sleep over a box. And yet, I was. When he finally fell asleep beside me, breathing deep and steady, I slipped out of bed. My bare feet knew the way down the hall, quiet, familiar. The moonlight spilled through the office window, soft and silver, and there it was, sitting exactly where I left it, as if waiting for me. I tried the spare keys from the junk drawer, one by one, gentle clicks in the dark. None fit. But when I leaned closer, I noticed faint scratches around the lock. Fresh ones. Someone had opened it recently. My stomach tightened, cold and sharp. I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves like a heartbeat under my touch. What was inside that he couldn't admit existed? Love letters? Old journals? Or something worse? Something alive only in the dark corners of our marriage. I placed it back where I found it, careful, deliberate. But as I turned off the light, I whispered to myself, "Whatever's in there, it's not just history." The next morning, David acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek, made his coffee, scrolled through the news, and chatted about traffic, all while that box sat quietly behind his office door. But I couldn't unhear the strain in his laughter, or the way his eyes darted when I passed the hallway. Guilt has a way of echoing, even through silence. I smiled back, pretending to believe him, pretending to be the woman who didn't notice. Inside, though, curiosity had turned into something heavier, suspicion. By afternoon, I found myself dusting that same shelf again, my hand hovering where the box used to be. I told myself to stop, to respect boundaries. But love, when cracked, doesn't respect much at all. It reaches for answers, even when they cut. I thought about our wedding day, about how sure I'd been that honesty was our foundation. How foolish that feels now, realizing you've been building a life on quicksand. That night, as I lay beside him, I listened to his breathing again. Calm, steady, undeservedly peaceful. My eyes traced the ceiling, every shadow stretching like a question mark. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew I wouldn't rest until I found it. Maybe tomorrow I'd clean his office again. Maybe the truth was just a key away, a key that wasn't meant to fit, but somehow would. The days that followed felt longer than usual, stretched thin by silence and curiosity. Every time David left for work, his office door clicked shut behind him, locked, every single time. It was new, that habit. I noticed everything. The way he guarded his phone now, the way he flinched when I walked too close to his desk. The box had stopped being an object. It had become a secret with its own heartbeat, pulsing between us, steady and relentless. I tried distracting myself with errands, with friends, even with yoga classes I never actually enjoyed. But my thoughts always circled back to that desk, that box, that lie. One afternoon, while dusting near the window, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, working late, muttering to himself, closing drawers a little too carefully. The sound of a key turning made my stomach twist. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was instinct. Then, one ordinary afternoon, my chance arrived. He was upstairs in the shower, humming, so unaware, so safe in his routine. I opened the desk drawer and ran my hand along the lining. And there it was, the tiniest bulge in the fabric, like something sewn into the seam. My fingers slipped inside and touched metal. A key, small, cold, and humming with possibility. My breath caught. The box had been waiting. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the key. The lock clicked open with an ease that felt like betrayal itself. Quick, quiet, inevitable. The lid lifted with a faint creak, releasing a smell of old paper and something faintly sweet, like faded perfume. Inside, bundles of handwritten letters, tied with a ribbon that had once been read but had surrendered to time. The first envelope on top carried a name that wasn't mine, written in soft, looping script. My dearest love, I still dream of you every night. My heart stumbled. I read the words again, slower this time, as if the meaning might somehow change. But it didn't. Every curve of that handwriting screamed intimacy, familiarity. I flipped through the stack, each letter ending the same way, each signed Claire. The dates ran years back, but then I saw one that stopped me cold. 3 years ago. We were already married by then. My throat tightened as though the air itself was punishing me for daring to breathe. I could hear the shower running upstairs, the water masking the chaos unfolding in my chest. The edges of the paper shook between my fingers as I whispered, 3 years ago. We were already together then. The words fell like stones in the stillness. My pulse was loud, my mouth dry. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or laugh at the absurdity of it. Instead, I just stood there, holding the proof that love had timelines he'd never shared. I didn't hear the water stop. I was too lost in the blur of dates and ink-stained confessions to notice the footsteps behind me. The moment his voice cut through the air, my heart slammed against my ribs. "What are you doing?" he shouted, towel still clutched around his waist. I froze, the letters trembling in my hands. "You said these were work notes," I murmured, my voice steadier than I felt. His face went pale, caught between panic and anger. "It's not what you think," he stammered. But the lie had already burned through the air between us. "Then tell me," I said, stepping closer, holding one of the letters up. "What does my dearest love have to do with your job?" He didn't answer, just stood there, his mouth opening, closing, like he was swallowing ghosts. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "You told me she was gone," I whispered. "You said she was dead." His jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the floor. "She is," he said. "She died before you and I met." My throat ached. "Then why?" I asked. "Are there letters dated after our wedding?" His silence was all the confirmation I needed. I placed the letters back into the box one by one, careful not to tear them, though my fingers wanted to. He watched, defeated, breathing hard. When I left the room, I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. He could keep his secrets, but he wouldn't keep his peace. Inside my chest, one thought pulsed steady as a drum. He didn't just keep the past, he kept her. That night, the fire flickered low, throwing soft shadows across the living room. I sat on the rug, the letters stacked neatly beside me like fragile evidence. David hovered near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Part guilt, part fear. He tried to speak, but every word seemed to trip on its own excuses. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Silence can be louder than shouting when betrayal's in the room. Finally, he broke. "Claire and we were together before you," he said quietly. "She died suddenly. I couldn't just throw them away." "You said you stopped seeing her before we met," I reminded him, my voice barely above a whisper. "I did," he said. Then, after a pause, "Mostly." That one word cracked something in me. "Mostly," I repeated, almost laughing, though it came out bitter. You mean, except for the letters dated 2 years after our wedding? His eyes flickered toward the floor, refusing to meet mine. The air between us felt heavy, thick with memories I hadn't lived. I waited, hoping he'd fight for the truth. He didn't. I reached for the letters again, running my thumb over the faded ink. You were writing to her while I was building a life with you, I said, each word measured. You mourned her in secret, while lying next to me every night. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. I felt no tears, no trembling, just an eerie calm. I gathered the letters, placed them carefully back into the box, and closed it with a soft click. Then, almost without thinking, I kept one. Not as a reminder. As a beginning. He wanted to live in his past. I'd make sure he stayed there. After he went upstairs, I stayed by the fire, watching the embers fade to gray. I thought about the woman in those letters, the way he'd written to her with tenderness he no longer offered me. Every word had weight, every sentence an intimacy I'd been denied. I wondered if he still whispered her name in his head while we talked about grocery lists and dinner plans. The worst part wasn't that he loved her. It was that he'd chosen to keep her alive, here, in our home. And now, she was everywhere. In his office, his dreams, his silence. When I finally stood, the room felt colder. The reflection in the window barely looked like me. Tired eyes, tight lips, a woman learning what betrayal really feels like. I didn't feel weak. I felt awake. Marriage had always been about trust, but I realized trust was fragile. A thread stretched thin until it snapped without sound. He thought I'd break. But pain, once named, becomes power. And I had just found mine. I placed the single letter I'd kept inside my nightstand drawer. It felt like holding a weapon disguised as paper. He thought secrets belonged to him, but I'd just learned how sharp they could be. When he came to bed, I didn't move. I lay still, breathing slow, pretending to sleep. His hand brushed my shoulder and I resisted the urge to flinch. Let him think I was unaware. Let him feel safe. Because when he finally drifted off, I was already writing the first line of a plan I'd never tell him about. The next morning, David acted as if our lives hadn't shifted overnight. He made coffee, hummed to the radio, kissed my temple, the kind of gestures meant to smooth cracks that were already too deep. I studied him, memorizing the rhythm of his lies, the subtle tremor in his voice. He thought time could blur the truth, that silence could bury what I'd seen. But once you've opened a box like that, you can't pretend it's empty. You start to see what's been hiding in plain sight. At work, I could barely focus. Every sound, a printer, a phone ring, pulled me back to that lock clicking open, that first line. My dearest love. I replayed his excuses again and again, each one thinner than the last. Grief, he'd said. Nostalgia, as if mourning justified deceit. I realized then that he wasn't haunted by her. He was addicted to the version of himself she'd adored. That was the real ghost. And I'd been living with it all along. That night, he suggested we go out to dinner. I smiled, nodded, even laughed at his jokes. It was almost easy pretending. But behind every word, I was building something, an invisible structure, piece by piece. I didn't know exactly what my revenge would look like yet, only that it would come quietly, like the turn of a key in a lock. He wanted to live in the past. I would make sure the past was all he had left to live in. It started small, a thought I tried to ignore, like a spark too dangerous to feed. But the idea grew each time I looked at that box. He wanted to keep the past alive? Fine. I'd help him do it. My way. One night after he fell asleep, I sat at his desk with one of Claire's letters spread before me. Her handwriting was soft, romantic, full of adoration. I studied every curve, every loop, until it felt like I could hear her voice whispering through the ink. Then I picked up my pen and began to mimic it. At first, my hand shook, but as the words flowed, so did something else. Calm. Each line I wrote carried the weight of his lies turned back on him. You broke me, I wrote. You'll never escape what you did. I aged the paper with tea, rubbed the corners to make them fray, even dabbed a little perfume, the kind I never wore. When I read it under the dim lamplight, It looked hauntingly real. Too real. I smiled. She had come back to life. The first time I replaced one of the originals, I thought my heart would burst through my ribs. But when he came home that evening and didn't notice, something shifted inside me. The fear began to fade, replaced by something sharper: control. I had learned his silence, his patterns, his guilt. He believed in ghosts. He just didn't know who was summoning them. And if he wanted to live with Claire's memory, then Claire would have a few more things to say. Each night became a ritual. After he'd gone to bed, I'd open the box and switch another letter. Half of them now carried my words, not hers. My versions dripped with tenderness on the surface, but beneath every sweet sentence was a blade. You said you loved me, yet you ruined us both. You thought you could bury me, but I'm still here. Each time I read them aloud in her voice, I almost pitied him. Almost. I sealed them with the same ribbon, placed the key back where he hid it, and smiled at my own reflection in the dark window. It wasn't rage that drove me anymore. It was precision. Revenge doesn't shout, it whispers. And mine was beginning to hum through the walls of this house. I even learned the scent of the old paper, the way it breathed when handled too long. I knew how long he spent in his office, when he'd check his briefcase, how he folded his shirts. Every habit became part of my choreography. One morning, I slipped a single envelope inside his briefcase. No return address, just his name written in Claire's perfect, ghostly hand. That evening, when he came home, the color had drained from his face. He stormed into the kitchen, eyes wild, paper trembling in his hand. "Did you open my box again?" he barked. I looked up from my glass of wine, calm, unbothered. "No," I said softly. "Why?" His hand shook as he held up the letter. "Someone sent me this. It's her handwriting, Hannah. She's dead, but this looks real." I tilted my head, pretending confusion. "That's impossible, isn't it?" I said. And in that moment, watching the terror flicker behind his eyes, I realized he didn't know what was real anymore. He barely slept after that night. I'd hear him pacing down the hall at 3 a.m., muttering under his breath, sometimes whispering her name as if summoning her might grant him forgiveness. I watched from the shadows of our bedroom doorway, pretending to be half asleep when he returned. Every morning he looked more hollow, his hands trembling slightly as he poured his coffee. "Did you hear something last night?" he'd ask. I'd smile, sip my tea, and say, "Just the wind." It was almost too easy, how guilt could turn air into a haunting. Within a week, he stopped using his office entirely. The room that once was his sanctuary now stayed closed, a silent monument to his own fear. I noticed how his eyes lingered on the hallway, how he avoided looking at the door. Once, he even suggested burning the letters, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. They were all he had left of her, he said. I agreed softly, hiding my satisfaction. He didn't realize half of her words were mine, half his memories, rewritten. By the time I found him sitting alone one night, pale, shaking, whispering apologies into the dark, I no longer felt pity, just clarity. He wanted to live in his past, so I gave him a past that bit back. And now, each letter he read dragged him deeper into it. I'd become the author of his guilt, the ghost he'd never escape. The next morning, I looked at him across the breakfast table and thought, "You're already haunted. You just don't know who by." He was unraveling by degrees, like a thread pulled loose with every sunrise. I'd find him sitting in the dark, the box open on his lap, letters scattered like ashes. His lips moved without sound, as if he was still talking to her, or maybe to himself. Sometimes he'd look up when I entered the room, eyes glassy, terrified. "She's angry," he whispered once. "I can feel it." I kept my tone soft, sympathetic. "Then maybe you should rest, David." But inside, I felt nothing but the slow, satisfying rhythm of justice finding its balance. The house grew quieter each day, though not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hums with madness. I could hear the floor creak under his pacing, the rustle of paper in the early hours. Once, I caught him tearing one of the forged letters apart, sobbing that he'd done enough. It should have hurt to see him like that. Once it might have. But by then, my heart had turned into something steadier, not cruel, just resolved. He had built a shrine to his lies. I had simply lit the candles. At dinner, he barely ate. His fork scraped against the plate, his eyes fixed on the window as if expecting to see her reflection there. I asked, gently, "Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "She won't let me." I almost smiled. "Then maybe you should listen to her," I said. He didn't realize I meant me. He never did. One night, I found him sitting on the floor of his office, the lamp casting a harsh yellow glow on his face. The box was open again, letters strewn across the carpet like fallen leaves. He was whispering, voice trembling. "She won't forgive me." I stepped inside quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe she doesn't need to," I said. He looked up at me, eyes hollow, like someone who'd finally realized his ghosts were real. "She loved me more than you ever did," he muttered. My breath caught, not in pain, but in final understanding. That was all I needed to hear. I walked to him, each step deliberate. He watched as I gathered the letters, one by one, placing them neatly back inside the box. "Then maybe," I said softly, "you should have stayed with her." He didn't move. I locked the box, feeling the click vibrate through my fingers like punctuation. For the first time, it wasn't his secret anymore. It was my ending, clean, precise, deserved. I placed the key on the table beside him and turned toward the door. His silence followed me like a shadow that had lost its light. The next morning, I packed my things, my clothes, my notebooks, my peace. The deed to the house was in my name, one of the few smart decisions I'd made early on. When I left, he didn't stop me. He just sat there, staring at the box like it might start breathing again. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. The world outside was cold and sharp, but it was mine. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. The drive away from that house felt like shedding a skin. Every mile loosened something inside me. The fear, the bitterness, the version of myself that waited for apologies that never came. I didn't cry. I didn't even glance at the rearview mirror. The box, the lies, the whispers, they could all stay behind. I had lived long enough as the audience to his unfinished love story. Now, I wanted to write my own. The road ahead was quiet, but not empty. Quiet, I realized, can also mean peace. For weeks, I stayed in a small hotel by the sea, the kind of place that smelled like salt and clean sheets. I spent hours walking along the shore, the cold sand grounding me in a way his words never had. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if he still heard Claire in the dark, if he still opened that box looking for forgiveness. But those thoughts faded with each tide. Whatever haunted him now belonged to him alone. That was the point. He'd trapped himself where I no longer existed. One morning, I woke before sunrise, stood by the window, and whispered to the reflection of the woman I'd become, "You made it out." I smiled at how light that truth felt. Leaving wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about release. I had locked his lies away, and in doing so, I'd freed myself. I didn't need his remorse or his ruin, just the silence of a new beginning. And as the first light touched the ocean, I promised myself I would never live inside someone else's secret again. Months later, I found a small seaside cottage that smelled of pine and sea salt. The air there was softer, forgiving. I bought a wooden desk by the window and on it placed a box. Simple, uncarved, unassuming. This one wasn't locked. Inside, I kept letters I wrote to myself. No ghosts, no confessions, just truth. "You kept your dignity," one said. "You turned betrayal into clarity." Another read, "You stopped waiting for someone else to define your worth." I never sealed them. They were meant to breathe. Most mornings, I'd sit with my coffee and add a new one, sometimes only a sentence or two. The sound of the waves outside became my metronome, a reminder that everything moves, even pain. I didn't think about David often, but when I did, it was with a strange kind of compassion. He had built a prison for his memories, and then he chose to live inside it. I had unlocked mine and walked free. We both got what we wanted, in a way. He had his past. I had my peace. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I opened the box and reread every letter. They weren't about him anymore. They were about me, The woman who survived the silence and found her voice in it. I traced my fingers along the wood and whispered, "This time, the box stays open." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. I smiled, set down my pen, and watched the last light fade, knowing that some closures don't need keys, just courage.